is John Hill. I am chairman of the Ulster Beekeepers Association, and welcome to our webinars. We've been running a series of webinars this year because, unfortunately, with COVID, we have been unable to run a conference, and so I've been running a series of webinars instead. We do hope, that we'll be able to return to the conference maybe next year, that hopefully with the COVID situation may start to hopefully settle down a little bit this year. Anyway, I'm delighted really this evening that we can welcome Professor Jamie Ellis from the University of Florida. Jamie gave us an excellent lecture a few weeks ago on swarming, and we're delighted he's back really for our last webinar this evening, in which he'll be talking about a year in the life of a honeybee colony. Now, we're delighted that our sponsors this evening are Vita Europe. Now, Vita is a company that, in fact, they have a worldwide distribution of products, and they are actually the world's largest dedicated bee health company. So we're delighted really is that Vita Bee Health is in fact sponsoring Professor Ellis's webinar this evening. And we indeed are grateful to all the sponsors we've had over this last number of weeks. Anyway, if I could really just introduce our speaker this evening, as I say, it's Professor Jamie Ellis from the University of Florida. And Jamie is the Gann Endowed Professor of Entomology in the Department of Entomology and Nematology at the University of Florida. If you want to know what nematology is, it's a study of worms. He has a BS degree in biology from the University of Georgia and a PhD in entomology from Rhodes University in South Africa. At the University of Florida, Jamie has responsibilities in the extension, instruction, and research. Regarding his extension work, Jamie created UFB College and the UF Master Beekeeping Program. And as instructor, Jamie supervises PhD and master's students. Currently, Jimmy and his team have over 30 active research projects in the fields of honeybee husbandry, conservation and ecology, and integrated crop pollination. So I have to say he's a very busy man. Anyway, as I say, I would like to welcome then Jamie to deliver his webinar this evening. Jamie.
All right, thank you. I really appreciate your willingness to have me back on. I've turned my video on very briefly just so that I could wave at all of you. If you joined me a few weeks ago, you know the way that I like to give my presentations is I like to turn my video off so that I can kind of turn over here and look at my presentation while I give it. But when we do the question and answer segment here at the end, I'll be happy to try my best to answer questions, but I'll also turn my video back on so that we can see one another as I go through the Q&A. As John had mentioned, if you'll consider putting questions that you may have for me in the Q&A box that should be towards the bottom of your screen. And I believe he's hoping that in the chat box, you will all say where you're from. And while he was speaking, I was looking over at the chat box, and so many places that have popped up are places that I've been fortunate to go and visit. Other places I haven't visited yet, maybe someday, but it just kind of brought back a flood of memories about time I've been able to spend with beekeepers from all over the place. So again, it's my pleasure to join you. My name is Jamie Ellis. I am joining you from sunny Florida. You can see, in fact, it's quite sunny outside today. Those are citrus trees just outside. I'm not trying to make you jealous. It's 80 degrees Fahrenheit, so that's roughly 25 or 27 degrees Celsius. Also have my background here because I'm here in my office. I even put a banana right behind me to make it look like I'm a healthy person. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn off my video. I'm going to start sharing my screen, and hopefully you guys can all see the presentation that I'll be sharing with you. So this evening, I'm going to be chatting with you a bit about the standard life cycle of honeybee colony. I call it a year in the life of a honeybee colony. So if you joined me last time, a few weeks ago, I spoke a lot, in fact, at great length about swarming. And swarming is just one component of a honeybee life cycle, a honeybee colony's life cycle. And so what I want to do is just walk you through the year. I know some of you are seasoned beekeepers, perhaps some of you are brand new beekeepers. Nevertheless, I think this is one of those presentations that we all benefit from seeing, and I'll elaborate on that a bit more moving forward. As John shared, I do work for the University of Florida. The state of Florida, if you're familiar with the U.S., is in the very southeastern corner of the U.S. We've got a peninsular part that sticks out. It's surrounded by the Gulf of Mexico on the left side, the Atlantic Ocean on the right side. We have a reasonable population in the state of Florida. I think it's close to 20 million people, about 19.5 million. And the university where I work, we have about 50,000 students. Our department, our entomology and nematology department, is the largest in the U.S. just based on the number of faculty and graduate students we have. We have 70 or so professors in our department, all who study some aspect of entomology or nematology. So it's really my pleasure to be able to join you all the way from sunny Florida and talk to you about bees. And I do know that a lot of you were on with me last time, so there might be a few things that you hear me talk about that you've heard last time, but hopefully I'll be able to introduce quite a new bit of content. But I will start by saying that for those of you who didn't join last time, I've actually been a beekeeper myself since I was 12. Beekeeping is one of those things that I've always found incredibly interesting. I really love working with bees. I love studying bees. I love talking about honeybees. And it's just really been one of my great pleasures to be able to go around the world and study and teach about and learn about honeybees. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you for joining me this evening. All right. As always, anytime we give our talks, I want to make sure and outline for you the roadmap of my talk, right? So by the time we get through the end of this presentation, there's three kind of take-home messages that I really want to leave you with. And the first of those is I want you to be able to identify the two principal or primary goals of a honeybee colony. Why are honeybees doing what they do? Secondly, I want you to indicate what it means when a honeybee colony swarms. And I know we talked about that at great length in the previous presentation, but I'm going to place it in its proper context with the honeybee year. And then finally, I want you to be able to match kind of the major changes in a honeybee colony to the season in which those changes occur. And so hopefully all of this will make sense kind of as we progress our way through this presentation. And I'll give you what I believe is a useful analogy to kind of help walk you through the way that I think specifically about honeybee colonies as they grow and age. So, and I promise there's going to be a lot of pictures. I know these first few slides are text heavy, but I promise you there's better images coming. But I want to pause for a second and just speak a little bit philosophically about honeybees. Now, I shared with you I was a beekeeper starting at age 12. I'm 44 years old now, so I've been keeping bees for, about 32 years. And when I first got into keeping bees, what I really wanted to know most about was simply how to keep bees. That's it. I wanted you to tell me what I needed to do in spring. I wanted you to tell me what I needed to do in summer and fall and winter and the times of transition between those seasons. I just wanted to know what to do. But the more I learned about honeybees, and especially the more I began to educate about honeybees, it began to dawn on me increasingly so that the best beekeepers, and hear me out because this is very key to this whole presentation, the best beekeepers are the ones who know what honeybees are trying to do at any given time. As a beekeeper, they know what they are trying to do. And then finally, they work to harmonize those two things. So know what your bees are trying to do, know what you as the beekeeper is trying to do, and work to harmonize those two things. And so many times as beekeepers, we're very aware of what we're trying to do. We want to make honey, we want to make splits, we want to pollinate crops, we want to move bees, split, whatever it is that we're trying to accomplish. But we oftentimes work against the bees because the bees have an entirely different mindset depending on the time of year. So if I had to restate that central axiom that I just made, I'd basically just would say in simpler terms, the best beekeepers are those who fully understand, at least as much as can be, honeybee biology. So I think as beekeepers, we owe it to ourselves, but we also owe it to our bees to understand them, to pursue knowledge related to colony growth and development, to understand what bees are trying to achieve so that when we manage them, we're working with them rather than against them. And that is very important for me. So let's just start from the beginning. As humans, we try to boil down some truths into very simple points. And if I had blackened out my screen and I were standing in front of all of you right now, and I were to ask you, what is it that organisms want to do? From the smallest single-celled bacterium all the way up to the largest mammal on Earth. What is it that organisms fundamentally want to do? And if I gave you a moment, I bet there would be a general consensus built around the idea that organisms want to do two primary things. They want to survive and they want to reproduce. Now, my talk about swarming last time was all about point 2, colony level reproduction. And we'll talk about that just as a bit of a summary here in the next couple of slides. But if you boil down what a bee colony is trying to do, is it's trying to survive so that it can reproduce. And take any animal, any plant, any fungus, any protist, right? Any organism that's alive is trying to remain alive, and they're trying to reproduce. And I hate to oversimplify it, but it really is that fundamental in a honeybee colony. Bees are trying to do these two things. They're trying to survive and they're trying to reproduce. And as I shared with you last time, reproduction in bees is not simply bees making more bees. It's not a queen bee having a nest of 100,000 bees or 200,000 bees or 500,000 bees. It's not that at all. Honeybee reproduction occurs less significantly at the individual level, and more significantly at the colony level. So if you overlay what colonies are trying to accomplish with season, it will start to make sense why they do what they do when they do it. And as beekeepers, we learn these things and we discover how to manage around them and with them to make sure that we are hitting our goals, the bees are hitting their goals, and everyone's happy and harmonized. So let's think about this from the beginning. Now, a lot of people will say, Jamie, why don't you just start your presentation on a year in the life of an apiary in January? Well, I would argue that January is a pretty arbitrary place. If I were to describe the growth and development of a human, where would I start? Well, I would start probably as a fertilized egg, right? The semen, the sperm hits the egg, you get this fertilized egg and it starts to divide. And before you know it, you've got this embryo, which continues to grow, and you've got the birth of this human. And then we follow it through, you know, as it's a child, as it's an adolescent, as it's a young adult, as it's an older adult, and it's finally its passing stage. Well, that's exactly what I want to do with you for the honeybee colony. So I am going to start with the honeybee colony at its point of birth and walk you through its growth and development as it gets back to what I would call its genetic death, as it were. And it all starts at the birth of a honeybee colony, the birth that in the beekeeping world we call the swarm. Now, again, I know that many of you are with me and spent an hour with me listening to me talk about swarming and how swarms function and the triggers that lead up to swarming and all of that stuff. All of you will remember that I was a huge endorsement for Tom Seeley's book, Honeybee Democracy. It really goes into great detail about swarming. I don't want to go into that. I want to do this more from a very superficial view, but I want to start you when a colony is giving birth, that moment of birth as the creation of a swarm. So swarming is how colonies give birth. When you're watching a colony swarm, you're watching a colony give birth. You all know as beekeepers, when a honeybee colony is swarming, right, it's usually the old queen that will leave. And I'm going to speak again in generalities here. So of course, there's going to be some biological wobble on either side of what I say. But in general, the old queen will leave with about half of the worker bees in that nest. So the colony essentially splits. It has budded, as it were, right? So let's just say you had a colony of 20,000 bees. It splits roughly in half. The old queen takes 10,000 bees with her. And that old queen, those bees with her leaving the nest, represent the baby beehive that has just been born into the world. And you know it's not that simple, right? You know before a human is born, there is 9 months of development. Sperm meets egg. The two split and you get zygote and all of these other developmental stages, all the way up to month 9, where the human physically comes out of the womb. Well, the same is true for swarming. Swarming, you know, the colony's not really born, as it were, the moment that a swarm comes out. There are preparations in that hive from the parental colony that occurs over days or weeks, almost like the gestation period, as it were. So within a functioning full-size colony, there is a gestating small baby colony that's about to be born, right? And what leads up to that is the production of drones, the production of new queens, the old queen losing weight, all of these minor steps that are necessary before the child colony can be born. So generally speaking, then this birth, this swarm, this child honeybee colony usually comes out in early spring. Now, humans don't follow similar timetables, so they're not really good analogies, right? We give birth, you know, our lady females, human females, that can become pregnant roughly once a month, and it depends on when they get pregnant. Of course, 9 months later is when they give birth. But that's not true with honeybee colonies. Honeybee colonies are intimately tied. Their biology is intimately tied to resource availability and season, right? So swarming generally doesn't occur in summer or fall, or hardly ever occurs in winter, but it almost always, or the vast majority of swarming, occurs in early spring. That is the nursery period, or the birthing period, for honeybee colonies. So in early spring, remember, this colony has just overwintered. It's hopefully come out of winter with sufficient stores. Hopefully there's nectar coming in from the outside, pollen coming in from the outside, so that that colony can begin to gestate that baby bee colony that's living in it. In early spring, when the weather is right, when the resources are ample, and when life is good, the baby bee colony finally is born from the womb of its parent, right? So this cluster of bees hanging in that tree has with it a queen. She is going to be the one laying eggs in the nest when they move into the new nest site. But that usually occurs in early spring. And if you were with me last time, I'm sorry that you have to hear this part again. But for those of you who are new, it is very, 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 very important to know that swarming is intimately tied to resource availability. I mean, look at this image. Look at that cluster of bees in the upper left-hand corner of this slide. Those bees are not taking with them comb. They are not taking with them a nest site. They are not taking with them pollen. They are not taking with them kilograms upon kilograms upon kilograms of honey. In fact, the only honey they have is in the bellies that they can carry for energy purposes, and hopefully giving them a good start when they find a new nest site. They're not carrying with them eggs, larvae, pupae, right? So essentially, that swarm has to find a new cavity in which to move and found a new nest. Like in this bottom left picture, you can see the opening of a tree cavity where that swarm in the upper left might move into. But the key is, if the swarm were to happen in summer, there wouldn't be enough floral resources available for the bees to bring in the nectar, construct the comb, store the nectar, convert it to honey, and survive the winter that in many parts of the temperate world might just be a couple months away. So as a result, colonies really, 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 really want to swarm in the weeks leading up to the major nectar flow. And for most of us in the temperate world, the major nectar flow is usually in full force somewhere in the dead middle of spring. So colonies are programmed to issue their swarms in the weeks leading up to the major nectar flow, as well as during the first few weeks of the major nectar flow, because that means that swarm hanging in the tree has the most resources available for her to be able to found that nest and store enough honey to survive winter. As I shared with you last time, research has shown the later in the major nectar flow a colony swarms, the less likely it is to survive winter. So back to what I said earlier on this slide, early spring is birthing season for honeybee colonies. It's when the honeybee colonies give birth. If you're a hunter, where I'm from, the southeastern United States, and it's culturally very common to be hunters. I'm a hunter myself, but when you're a hunter, a lot of the hunting seasons or the fishing seasons are linked to when animals give birth, to avoid, open season during those periods of time. Similarly, honeybee colonies have a season of giving birth, and now we're going to follow this baby beehive through its growth and development throughout the honeybee colony year. So in mid to late spring, that colony has found a cavity, has moved into it, and they are collecting the copious, abundant resources available in the environment, principally nectar, which provides the energy source to produce lots of comb. And they need comb because they're moving into a cavity usually that doesn't have any. So they have to build comb so the queen can get laying immediately. Furthermore, they have to build comb so that they can store pollen. And they also have to build comb so that they can store all of that honey that it's going to take for them to survive winter when fall rolls around and then winter comes. So essentially, a lot of bee energy in the early stages of colony growth goes into the production of wax so that it can be used as a storage site for honey or as a nursery for brood. And in addition to that, that mid to late spring, not only are they maximizing the nectar resources that are available in the environment, but they're collecting lots and lots and lots of pollen, because pollen is what is necessary to rear that new brood that the queen is producing by virtue of laying eggs. So there's a huge energetic need for sugar in the form of nectar, therefore honey, and there's a huge protein, vitamin, mineral, nutrient need for brood production purposes, and that comes by way of pollen collection. So essentially, by the time mid to late spring rolls around, the colony is in absolute maximum growth phase. And as early as mid to late spring, they are doing everything to ensure that when the major nectar flow stops, usually in late spring, they are ready to survive winter, even if there's low nectar or pollen availability during the summer months. So spring is crucial to the success of that baby beehive. That baby beehive that was born usually in early spring, had to go find a new nest site, had to move into it, develop that nest site, and ready it for winter that may even seem like to you it's so far away that you wouldn't think about it. But the bees know if they don't do something about it right now, their chances of survival plummet. Now, what are we as beekeepers doing at this same time? Well, we're trying to make as much honey as possible, usually, right? So since honey production season correlates with swarm season, they co-occur. That means as beekeepers, you often need your colonies to be the strongest that they will be all year at the very same time of the year when colonies naturally are trying to split themselves in half, and sometimes not even just once. Sometimes they'll issue that primary swarm and then issue a secondary swarm and a tertiary swarm, further and further and further depleting the bee reserves in that original production colony. So as beekeepers, they often find themselves at odds with the strongest drive in bees, which is to reproduce. And I just want to hunker down on that statement for just 1 second before we walk them through the rest of the year. As I shared with you last time, and I will reiterate this time, reproduction is an incredibly strong drive. And as I said last time, everything that can reproduce wants to really, 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 really bad, right? My wife and I have 4 children, and you would say, well, that's a lot or not a lot, depending on the number of children that you have. But let's face it, even when folks have a finite number of children, they're usually doing what it takes to produce children outside of childbearing time. And the reason I point that out is reproduction is a strong drive. It's strong for humans. It's strong for plants. It's strong for animals. It is a strong drive for bees. In fact, I would argue to you, if I had to boil down what bees are really trying to do more than anything else, I would argue that they're trying to reproduce. And you would say, well, Jamie, a few slides back, you said they're trying to survive winter. And I would argue that they're really trying to survive so that they can reproduce. Swarming is what bees want to do, and they work all year to do it. So as we have this situation where they move into a nest, mid to late spring is coming around, they're outfitting their nest, they're growing their colony, they're readying themselves for the approaching winter. Now, let's talk a little bit about what that looks like. Now, again, as I've shared with you already multiple times, I tend to speak in generalizations. I suppose everybody does. But in general, the new queen will begin laying eggs in the middle of a comb. And for that matter, all queens typically do this. Their first eggs that they will lay into an empty comb tend to be in the middle, and they will go in a spiral pattern laying eggs to fill the comb. Now, we put bees into cubes, right? You hear in the bottom right, it's a schematic. I'll call it a Langstroth style hive. I know you guys, depending on where you're from, might use different hive configurations, but this is, say, the standard Langstroth style hive that has 6 frames. So we think in cubes. And furthermore, we think almost in 2 dimensions, right? Because we'll take out a 2-dimensional frame, a front and a back, right? Or an X and a Y axis. But if you really think about it, and I think this is very poetic, honeybees most often build their nests in cylinders, right? Cavities like trees. And so we tend to think of our colonies inhabiting cubes on these rectangular frames that we give them. But I think it's way more poetic than that. And let me explain to you the way that the typical nest configuration occurs. Because queens start laying in the middle and kind of spiral outwards, again, and this is very slightly, but generally speaking, the brood pattern on any one frame is roughly the shape of an oval. You can see it in this uppermost frame, right? Oftentimes not laying eggs in the upper corners or maybe the lower corners. And so you get this kind of oval pattern. I call it a squashed basketball. And the frames or the combs that occur in the middle of the nest tend to have a larger brood pattern than the frames that occur as you move from the center of the nest out. And I love, love, love this image in the bottom right because it really illustrates that. If you look at just the brood area on a 2-dimensional comb, you will think that the brood area is simply an oval. But in reality, if you move from the center frames to the outer frames of a nest, the brood area in a typical year, a typical time point, will shrink. The combs in the middle have the most brood and the combs on the periphery have the least amount of brood. So in theory, if you were able to excise everything from the honeybee nest except the brood, you would have something roughly the shape of a squashed basketball. So it's a bit of a squashed sphere. So again, look at this image. You get these larger brood patterns in the middle, and as you move from the middle to the outside, it shrinks. If you took everything away that wasn't brood, you'd have roughly a brood nest that is the shape of a squashed basketball. So for purposes of better explanation, I'm going to turn my video on right now because I'm going to use my hands to explain this a little bit further. So you have a basketball that's somewhat squashed. So it's not necessarily spherical. It's kind of pinched out at the ends. Now, the way that bees build their colonies, or sorry, they outfit their nest, imagine this basketball. Imagine now that you had a jacket that you could put on the upper half of that basketball, right? So you've got a basketball, and now you're covering the upper half of that basketball with a jacket. That jacket is essentially where bees store pollen in their hive. If you look back on this image that I have up for you, basically the brood, the basketball, is surrounded by a thin jacket of pollen, and bees store pollen close to the brood because that's where they need it. They need pollen to mix into the brood food. So you've got this basketball, you've got this jacket that covers the upper half of that basketball, that jacket being pollen. And then again, we're in a cylinder, in a tree trunk. Basketball on the bottom, a thin layer of pollen, and everything up in that cylinder then is honey. So I love this idea that bees are making in a 3D manner more of this spherical brood pattern that they layer with a thin layer of pollen and then store honey on top of as they move up. I just love that idea. And when you see it, you'll see how when you work your colonies and see it in the frames, you just get this image, big, rich, full brood patterns in the center combs that kind of shrink as you move from inside to out. The bees are expert architects. Put the honey the pollen where they need it and insulate their colony, their brood nest with honey, because usually the outer combs contain honey. Everything above them is usually honey. And it's just this perfect nest design to maximize what they are trying to do, maximize their survival moving forward in this harsh world. All right, that's usually mid to late spring. Again, in mid to late spring, they spend so much energy collecting and storing nectar. Nectar is their energy. Honey is their energy. It's the fuel that moves bees. It's the, I hate to use it in a time of climate change, but it's the gasoline that powers the vehicles, or the diesel that powers the engines, right? It's the energy source. There's so much energy stored in honey that bees can use it to move. They can use it to forage. They can use it to construct wax. They can use it, most importantly, to heat. And so they have to store as much as possible to survive winter. Let me give you a human parallel. My family and I, we have a fireplace in our house for really mainly for aesthetic reasons, because in Florida, you don't need it that much. But in spring and summer, we maybe chop down small trees and split wood so that the wood can dry amply, so that by the time winter comes around, we're able to use that wood and fire to heat our home. Well, bees store honey in spring to be able to use that energy to heat their home and move their bodies in periods of time where nectar or honey isn't otherwise available environmentally. Remember, spring is the crazy, dynamic, exploding work period of the year for this baby bee colony. Now, as we move out of spring, the nectar flows begin to wane. And as beekeepers, it's crucial that you know this part here. Thing number one, colonies are coming out of spring the strongest that they will be all year. Nectar was falling over itself to get inside the hive. Pollen was falling over itself to get inside the hive. The bees were using that in real time to make more bees, to grow their nest, to have this ample beast, the colony, grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. But it's also a crucial time of year for the likelihood or chances of it being able to survive winter. Why is that? So I'm going to turn my slide or video back on, because I'm going to use my hands here again. But imagine a situation then where you've got this colony and it's spring and the resources are just coming in. Your colony population begins to grow because it's correlated to resource availability. And in late spring, resource availability starts to decrease. So correspondingly, colony populations begin to peak and slowly start to decline as resources decrease. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is involved in all of this, something I haven't mentioned yet, is that colonies are natural hosts for fungal diseases, bacterial diseases, viral diseases, and arthropod invaders, varroa, small hive beetles, the two wax moth species, and on and on and on and on and on and on. So you get a colony that's been growing and growing and growing, but it's growing at a rate that its pests and pathogens can't keep up with it. So essentially, the colony's growth is outpacing its threats. You know, you hear beekeepers say a lot, a good nectar flow solves nearly every problem that they have. Well, that's kind of true. So in spring, the colony's growth is outpacing the things that's working to weaken it. But in late spring, especially early summer, as that population crests and begins to come down, your pest and pathogen populations continue to go up. So what you do is you get this natural point in the colony year where when the bee populations are turning down, but the pest populations continue to grow, it's that point where they intersect that your problems start happening. Bee populations continue to decrease throughout summer. Pest populations continue to go up, and you get lots and lots and lots of problems developing in summer. So let me give you some of the things that now young adult bee colony has to contend with. It was basically a child, a juvenile, and a younger adult all throughout spring. Now it's hit its slightly older adult stage in summer. Yes, in many places around the world in summer, you get nectar coming in and pollen coming in. But it's rarely at the same levels that they were coming in back in spring. So what that colony is faced with is growing levels of pests and pathogens. It's faced with intermittent nectar and pollen availability. It's here today and gone tomorrow and back next week and so forth. And in many areas around the world, it's interacting or trying to live in a period of high temperature, right? Summer is usually when it's hottest, right? So you get this mixture of stressors that are capable of causing downstream effects in the life of the colony later in the year. This is when Varroa populations establish and grow and wreak havoc. This is when, if they didn't make a lot of honey in spring, they can starve to death unexpectedly if there's little nectar coming in. This is where their brood production may begin to taper depending on pollen availability. And in Florida, at least where I live, this is where high temperatures demand so much attention from the bees. They have to gather water to cool the nest, et cetera, et cetera. So queens slowly began to decrease their egg output, usually in response to the decreasing amount of nectar and pollen, more importantly, pollen availability in the environment. And the key point here is colonies are more likely to survive winter. Look at this last point. Colonies are more likely to survive winter when they encounter favorable conditions over summer. I mean, if you were just judging a colony's likelihood of surviving winter based on spring, almost everything would look like it was going to survive winter. Spring is the land of plenty. It's the land of milk and honey. There's just stuff everywhere all the time. All colonies almost look good in spring. But summer is where the problems begin to bubble to the top. Colonies are crowded. They are hot. They are parasitized. They are stricken with pathogens. And not only that, but summer is the time of year that colonies begin increasingly so to invest in the production of those bees that will carry those colonies through winter. We call them winter bees, right? So in late summer, kind of mid to late summer, colonies are investing. They're changing physiologically and starting to invest in the production of winter bees. Now, think about it. If your colonies are producing the bees kind of August, September, and October that will carry those colonies through winter, and it just so happens that Varroa populations tend to be highest in August, September, and October, you arguably are making the most important bees of the year at the most stressful time for the colony. So summer, are you controlling pests and pathogens? How are their food reserves? Are your queens healthy and looking good? How are they handling temperature stress? What are you doing as a beekeeper to give the colonies every leg up that they need to survive the coming winter? So usually the later into the summer and summer you move, that's where crisis often strikes. Boom, August, Varroa populations are roaring through the roof. Pathogen loads are growing, super hot, no nectar. It all depends on what unique stressors align where you are to cause these problems, but colonies are under maximum amount of stress, often in late summer as they ready themselves. Now, the interesting thing is that fall can be a bit of a reprieve. In many areas in the temperate world, you actually get a fall nectar and pollen flow. It's funny, you tend to get a lot of flowers in spring, some flowers in summer, and a reasonable bump in fall. And depending on where you live, that nectar and fall pollen flows might be sufficient to ready your colonies to go through their dormant stage in winter. But from a colony's perspective, what are they trying to do? Are my diseases and pests under control? Do I have ample stores to survive winter? Is the queen okay? Are we ready for this thing? Now, it's important for you to remember, back to slide 3 or so, that bees want to survive winter uncompromised, and they want to survive winter so that they can reproduce. In other words, swarm. So these colonies that are now hitting their increasingly early adult years, right? They're maximizing their adult longevity when they swarm. They're at this point, colony success in fall is what makes or breaks their ability to reproduce in spring. If heck, it affects their ability to even survive winter in the first place. And if they survive, they might limp through to the finish line and never be able to reproduce. Often we will say, oh, these colonies didn't swarm. They're from a non-swarming stock. Well, often it's because they just weren't healthy enough heading into winter to come roaring out in early spring to have the populations necessary to reproduce. So fall will make or break a colony. Will it do what it needs to do to survive winter at a population that allows it to reproduce in spring? So if you're lucky, then those colonies will have pollen and nectar flows in their areas of which they can take advantage and ready themselves for the long winter potentially ahead. Queens will reduce their egg output significantly, possibly even stopping altogether, depending on where you live. Here in Florida, where I live, queens never stop laying. We never get a brood break. But in much of the colder climates around North America, and certainly in Northern Europe and other places around the world, queens will stop laying altogether just to match the resources. There's not any resources coming in. They stop laying eggs, and that's it. When that happens, the bees that are in the nest are the ones that are either going to carry that colony through latter fall and winter or not. But it's still a time of year that bees can have unchecked pest populations. If you did nothing to fix your pest populations in summer, then there's a high probability that your colonies are going to bottom out in fall, but certainly by winter. What are some other things that you see happening in a colony in fall? Well, you have one of the most, I don't know, alarming, interesting, amusing, I'm not sure what you want to call it, but phenomena associated with bees. Remember, colonies will produce male bees, these drones. Drones' primary function is to be available to reproduce with queens, to mate with queens. Well, most of the queens in a honeybee colony or an apiary are made during early spring, during that swarm season, when colonies are putting out a lot of virgin queens, and those virgin queens need drones with which to mate. So by the time fall rolls around, colonies aren't thinking about making new queens. So instead, from a biological perspective, bees are like, you know what? These drones are going to just sit in here over winter, eat our resources, and contribute nothing to the function of the hive. We don't need them this time of year. So what you see is one of the saddest things for males and all of the animal kingdom. You see the females in the hive evict the males. That's what you see here. You see a cluster of drones on the nest entrance. The females will evict the males, who will either starve to death or die of exposure at the nest entrance. Now, what's interesting is we don't see this phenomenon much in Florida because it stays warm through much of fall and winter. Basically, the drones just die off in the colonies. But in much of the temperate world, the worker bees evict the drones, and that's basically their way of saying, we are ready to move into winter. It is time for us to get rid of the freeloaders, as it were. Now that colony that is reaching full maturity it turns its attention, it diverts all of its efforts to surviving winter. Remember, I told you early on, colonies want to do two things: survive winter so that they can reproduce. So survival and reproduction. And early winter is when colonies begin to hit that dormancy state. They're not really dormant. They're actively generating heat to be able to keep themselves alive. They're doing that with the food reserves, with honey. So in winter, nearly all of a colony's efforts are devoted to thermoregulation, staying warm. And if you get these intermittent warm days, the bees may move from that cluster to other honey reserves in the hive. You know, it's one of those weird things that when they cluster, they are basically using the honey right around them to heat the nest. So if you have an unusually long cold spell, colonies can actually starve in the winter, even though the hive is full of honey. But it's just that it got so cold, they used the honey right around themselves and were not able to break the cluster to slide a little bit over, just a few centimeters over, and access the honey that might be just a little bit away from their cluster. So early winter is when colonies are focused on clustering and keeping themselves warm. They usually are not rearing brood. The bee population slowly declines over the time because brood is not being reared to replace those dying bees. And you even get pest and pathogen, natural declines in pest and pathogen loads over winter, just because the conditions aren't favorable for them either. So what I would argue is that maybe a lot of time in the early winter, maybe the first half of winter or 2/3 of winter, is just it just concerns thermoregulation. Let's stay warm. But really in late winter, that last third of winter is when colonies start to gestate that brand new baby bee colony. Now you're like, I don't see that happening, but it is happening. The queens will start to lay eggs because a teeny little bit of pollen starts coming in, and the temperatures slowly start to increase. And basically that colony, if you really think about it, they're coming out of winter, and usually when the colony wakes up, it's 4 to 8 weeks before they start swarming. So they really start, in some cases, making those early swarm preparations by the time they come out of winter and roll into spring. So in late winter, kind of like this time of year, those resources slowly become available. They slowly start producing brood. You don't see it happening because it may be just kind of cool and you don't always catch the bees flying, but there's something happening in that colony. A baby bee colony is growing and developing, and soon the resources will be there. Soon the weather will be there. Soon the conditions will be there, and that colony that has moved all the way through those 4 seasons is now ready herself to give birth, to swarm. And those preparations are a year in the making. And they start when they themselves were just a baby bee colony in early spring the year before. So everything that colony is doing from mid-spring to late spring, to the first half of summer, to the second half of summer, to early fall, to late fall, to early winter, to late winter, everything they do throughout the year is so that they can get to this point where they themselves are now reproductive and are able to give birth to their own colony. It's a really poetic life cycle. It's a really beautiful thing to consider. And if we are good beekeepers, we have a responsibility to time our management consistent with the biology of the bees to maximize their health and productivity as we work with them to achieve our own beekeeping goals. I've talked a lot. I know it was a very theoretical talk, a lot about bee biology, but if you'll indulge me for 7 more minutes, I want to give you a quick little bit of management that's completely unrelated. I know a lot of folks jump on these calls and don't just want to hear biology. They want to hear a little bit about bee management. So I'm going to give you one tiny piece of management advice just so you can feel that you're able to leave fulfilled. And I think you'll love it. So hang on with me for 5 more minutes and then we'll open it up for Q&A. This is free information. It's bonus material courtesy of the University of Florida. So one little piece of management advice that I love to give people is I like to use nucleus colonies to solve a lot of my colonies problems. I see Randy Oliver was talking about creating a nuke and using it correctly. He may have covered this, but I just want to say very quickly, I love to have nukes on hand to solve my queen problems. I give a talk on queen problems and how to mitigate them. That's not the talk I'm giving you today. I'm just showing on this slide a number of problems that queens can encounter. You don't have them, they're dead, they're failing. You've got laying workers, supersedure, multiple queens swarming, African bees, whatever. But there is one way of requeening colonies that to me solves 99.9% of all the queen related issues that I can think. And that's requeening a colony using a nuke. So look at this image. You got 2 production colonies and you've got 1 nucleus colony. I am going to pretend that this one colony has a failing queen or a missing queen or whatever. There's a queen problem that I need to fix. Let me tell you a quick and dirty way to fix it using a nuke. All right. So we're looking at schematically 2 colonies from this one production colony from above and its neighboring nuke. All right. So this is the production colony. It's got 10 frames. This is the nuke. It's got 5 frames. The nuke has a queen, bees, brood, honey, pollen. Life is good. My production colony is queenless. It's got a couple of frames of honey, pollen. You know, in a typical queenless situation, you have combs with older brood. They might be empty combs. You might have a couple of combs with queen cells. Let me tell you briefly what I do, and then I'll open the floor to Q&A. Briefly what I do is I'll go through my production colony and remove 5 frames of bees and brood or queen cells. All right. So there's no queen in here. So in this case, you see, I took this frame and these 4 frames. One of those frames was the honey pollen frame. The other 4 frames, a couple of them had queen cells on them. Some of them maybe had older brood or empty comb. I removed these 5 frames and you can see that they are now absent from my production colony. I take those 5 frames, I sit them on the ground just beside my production colony. Then I take all 5 frames from my production colony and push them up against one side of the box, like you see in this upper image. So now I've created a space for 5 frames. What I'll do is I'll take my entire nucleus colony, bees, brood, honey, pollen, frames, queen, and all. I take the entire nuke and drop it right into that 5 frame space in my production colony. Then I take the frames that I had put outside of the production colony that were originally from the production colony. I put those 5 into my nuke. So now I have a queen right production colony and a queen less nuke that I walk the nuke through the process of requeening. In this method, my production colony never misses a beat. If they swarm, I instantly give them bees, brood, and a queen. If they're laying workers, I instantly give them bees, brood, and a queen. If it's a failing queen, I'd kill her and instantly give them bees, brood, and a queen. So my motto is I work through my problems with nukes, but I leave my production colonies unscathed, strong, and ready to continue to be healthy and productive for hopefully the rest of the year. And I know that there's some questions some of you are going to ask me about this, because every time I talk about requeening with a nuke, I get questions. So the last 2 minutes that I want to share is I'm going to quickly bring up something that I want to show you. If you want to know more about that nuke requeening method, you can Google. So the University of Florida has electronic information documents, or we call them fact sheets. UF calls them EDIS documents. That's EDIS. If you Google EDIS honeybee nuke, EDIS honeybee nuke, and press enter, the very first document option for you will be a document that I wrote on how to use nukes in your operations. And if you scroll on down, I show you using exactly the same schematics, how to requeen production colonies using a nuke. And again, I found that by Googling Edis honeybee nuke. And now, as the last minute before I open the floor to Q&A, I would like to invite all of you to take out your smartphone and take a picture of this slide. Why? Because it has a few things that might be of use to you. Number one, it has my lab's website. Number two, it tells you how you can follow my lab's Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook accounts, which you can find at UF Honeybee Lab. Again, that's at UF Honeybee Lab. It tells you how to find my lab's free podcast. We call it 2 Bees in a Podcast, where we interview beekeepers and bee scientists all around the world to give you the latest knowledge on honeybees and beekeeping from a global research and beekeeper management perspective. And finally, it's got my email address. So if you have questions that I can't get to during the Q&A period, you've at least got my email address so you can reach out to me. So I'm going to leave this up for about 15 more seconds. Please, please, please take a picture of this or a screenshot of this. After the next 10 seconds or so are up, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn my video on so that you can see me and I can see you as we go through the Q&A session. So with that said, I'll turn it back over to our moderators and invite you guys to go over the Q&A with me at this point.
All right. Jamie, thank you very, very much indeed. That was excellent. And just before we start the Q&A, if we could just have a short video about V2B Health, who in fact are our sponsors for the webinar this evening. So if you just bear us with a little time, but certainly I would like to, we could show this video because they, V2B Health are I think the largest dedicated bee health company in the world. Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you very much indeed again to Vita for very kindly sponsoring this webinar. So, Jamie, I think we could move on, say, to the questions and answers. I think the first one is really a comment from Christopher Slade. He said, in over 40 years of beekeeping, I found that swarming makes a very sharp peak on the graft in the 3rd week of May. Now, he may be talking about European times maybe compared to Florida, but would you like to comment on that?
Yeah. So again, a lot of this is linked to weather and resource availability. You know, we're going to start having swarms in Florida in the next couple of weeks, and it'll probably peak for where I am kind of somewhere in mid to well, maybe early to mid-April. But it all expands and contracts based on your length of winter. Right. So the longer winter you have, the tighter the window it pushes on both sides. And the shorter window you have, the more that expands. So your observation is good, and it's probably very true for your area. And one of the things that I like to tell beekeepers is find out when that is for you and your area, and start knowing in advance of that. If it happens to be mid-May for you, you start knowing about a month out from that. I need to start watching for this because my colonies are going to swarm. Like I said, for us, it's here in a couple of weeks. And, you know, if I were managing hundreds or thousands of colonies, I would know that these are things I need to begin to address pretty soon.
Right. Okay. Next one is from EJ, and he said, are we certain that drones don't participate in colony care?
I've had that question actually recently. I've had the question before as well. Every time I look up information on this, I'm able to read papers where people find nuggets of information that they think point towards other functions of a drone. But I've not been overwhelmed by those suggestions yet. And one of the things that I say is that, and I even shared this with the beekeeper actually, who emailed me this past week about it. We oftentimes look really bad on drones because all they do is mate with the queens and they have no other function in the nest. But I want to remind everybody that that is an incredibly important function, right? We give all the credit to the queen because she's there laying eggs all the time, and her pheromones ensure homeostasis, et cetera. But those workers are only half the queen. The other half is drones. So yeah, you know, they're not building comb, and they're not foraging for the hive. They're not defending the nest, but worker bee ability to do all of those things come from the drone fathers in addition to their queen mothers. So we tend to minimize what they do around the nest and call them, you know, fat and lazy and all this stuff, but really their function is incredibly important, even if the time period that they offer that function is incredibly truncated. So in biology, I would never sit before you and tell you drones have no other function in the nest. But right now, their overwhelming function is to mate with a queen. And I've been unsold on the other potential functions that I've heard, but that certainly doesn't mean that we, the scientific community beekeepers, won't find some incredibly important things drones do in addition to being available to mate with queens. Until then, it seems like mating with a queen is important enough for me.
All right. Okay, again, this is from EJ, and it's, I just hope to see we can understand what she's to ask. Is a swarm able to bring back to the nest 6 kilograms of nectar as a full colony does in a day when the nectar flows? And what does this mean for colony development speed?
Yeah, so I've never seen research on that, but basically what I would answer to that is a colony's ability to bring back nectar is no doubt linearly at least related to the number of bees in the nest that are functioning as foragers. So my guess is as that swarm lands and goes into that colony, it's just a few weeks later that it's maybe able to keep up with its parental colony. But up until that time, they're losing bees before bees are being replaced through the production of brood. So, you know, even though I've never seen any research on it, my guess is it takes a few weeks, maybe a month before they're able to bring in as much honey as they would have if they had, you know, necessarily remained in their parental colony. And that's just a function of the number of bees available to do the work.
Yeah, right. Okay. Next one really is from Wally Shaw, who's a very prominent beekeeper in Wales. And he said, would Jamie like to comment on the strategy the mother queen leaves her daughter with the generous inheritance of the parental home with all its resources and takes the risk of finding a new home and generating the resources to survive the winter?
Yeah, so honeybee colonies are anomalies in many ways. And so this is one of those things that people struggle with as well. So you're right. The swarm is taking a significant risk, right? The old queen and half the bees are leaving, and they may not make it. In fact, I think research amply shows that a lot of them don't make it. But the parental colony, it does have a lot of resources and all the brood, but it's not itself without risk. First of all, they have to make a queen successfully, right? That queen has to emerge. She has not to be stung to death by her sisters. She has to go out and mate and come back and start laying eggs, and all that has to be successful. And as all of you who were with me last time will remember, and I'm around everything up to the nearest week, generally speaking, when a colony swarms, the queen that's developing, it takes about a week for her to emerge, 2 weeks for her to mate, and 3 weeks for her first egg to come out, go through all of its life cycle to become a worker bee 21 days later. So you've basically got 6 weeks of brood production loss in the parental colony that swarms. And so then the question is since the old queen and the bees are leaving, why would the swarm take such a risk? Why wouldn't it maybe start provisioning a nest before it ever leaves its original nest in the first place? And then once that future nest is provisioned, then move into it. Well, at the moment, the most compelling theory for that is in preparation for swarming, colonies begin to make queens. In fact, they will pull out those queen cells and cap those queen cells in advance of the bees swarming with the old queen. And it's almost like the bees are waiting to see that happen before they are comfortable leaving with the swarm. Well, the downside is if they waited until one of those new queens emerged, now you have an old mother and a young daughter who might fight themselves to the death. So staying behind also comes with risk as well. So, you've got these ecological issues at play, and the way the bees have handled it is send off the old mom and half the bees to a new nest site at great risk to her. And hopefully the risk that the parental colony is taking on is requeening themselves. One colony gets the queen, but no resources. One colony gets the resources, but no queen. And both of them are taking a risk to ultimately make it. The good news is bees have been doing this for eons, so they're reasonably good at solving both of those issues.
This was from Des McGinnis. Now, he says it's a novice question, so maybe he's a beginner beekeeper, but he says if hive temperature is so important through winter, why not give them a helping hand by heating the hive?
Yeah, so some people have asked that question and have actually tried to do just that. Usually beekeepers who live in really cold climates will simply insulate their colonies in an attempt to help that out. But there are hive heaters out there. Most of the hive heaters made today are used to address varroa, but there are hive heaters out there built specifically for the purpose of maybe warming a colony through winter. But I will tell you that itself is not without risk. And let me give you an example why. In Florida, there's actually a couple of potential problems. Number one, if the winter is much too long, bees can run out of honey and therefore not have enough to survive winter. If the winter is much too hot, like it is in southern Florida, right, the southern half of the state where I live, the bee activity, because they don't cluster, they're foraging and flying around and rearing brood, bee activity can outpace the honey stores, even though there's no nectar coming in. So, heating a colony to help them could lead to other problems downstream as well, where they're just too active and burn through their honey too fast. So, I've heard people posit that. I've seen people study it, but it's just one of those things that hasn't ever really come to the market in a way that lots and lots and lots and lots of beekeepers have adopted it. But it's, who knows? I will tell you that the opposite is what a lot of beekeepers are doing in Canada. As an example, a lot of beekeepers move their colonies into massive refrigerated rooms so that they are refrigerating their colonies. Now, I'm not talking about 10 or 15 colonies. I'm talking hundreds and thousands of colonies in these massive refrigerated rooms in order to stabilize the cold temperature for bees and maximize how long they can push through on their food stores without experiencing these in massive environmental, super cold, super hot, lots of snow, all these other things that bees encounter in the natural world. So good question, but it's sometimes what seems intuitive may not be when you consider you might be creating a problem the other direction, where they stay too warm and just by sheer activity outpace their food reserves.
Okay. The next question is from Ulrich. I know that artificial swarming a beekeeper can do, and we trick the queen and colony. Do you think that we really can fool the bees with such a natural drive for reproduction and stop them from swarming for good, for example, interfering or artificial swarming?
Yeah, so I don't know how good we are at fooling bees in general. I'll say that first. But secondly, our hobbyists and sideliners in the States tend to do a lot more hands-on swarm control, adding space, cutting queen cells, clipping the queen's wing, things like that. But our commercial beekeepers split heavily in spring for swarm control purposes. Now, I'll say something that I haven't said in this talk, but I said in the last talk. Because swarming is reproduction, and because reproduction is the strongest drive in an organism, you can do whatever you want to, and occasionally they still try to swarm, and that's just because reproduction is what they want to do. But I do think, and I've seen it with my own eyes and seen it in my own apiaries, splitting colonies at the right time somehow removes the stimulus for a lot of colonies to swarm. They may think they swarmed, I don't know. There may be other cues that we're missing, but I know it is a practice that lots of people use, and depending on how they use it, with some success. So whether we fooled them or not, I'm not sure, but it still seems to get me to the desired end.
Effect, right? Okay. This is from Darcy. Have you noticed a difference in the life cycle of the hives with climate change?
So I have not, but what I would argue is probably going to happen in that case is the elongating of the warm season. Again, I live in an area where there's nothing but an elongated warm season. So my guess is that for a lot of areas that are colder in winter than I am here in Florida, you're going to start seeing bee seasons increasingly so match what we see here in Florida. The real issue that you're going to run into is, what do bee seasons in Florida look like when it gets warmer, right? Because there's not good models for it being warmer than the hottest it already can be. But there's a lot of examples of what happens when it's warmer than in areas that are already cold, right? So you guys might just look like us. The big question is what are we going to look like if it keeps warming? But I think what it will do is it's going to shrink the winters on either end and expand that kind of, and elongate the growth and developmental season based on a lot of the stuff that I would see pretty standard in warm climates. And another bigger issue maybe is weather patterns, but even more importantly, what is it going to do to forage? Because this is going to affect plants as well, right? Their nectar and pollen sources. And the question, there is how are they affected? And that's what feeds the bees. And so some clarity on that would be welcomed.
Yeah, right, indeed, right. This is one relating to your using the nuke to help your production hive. And it says, just to be sure, you do not use a newspaper when you put the two colonies together. Don't you have a problem with fighting?
I chuckle because I've alluded to my lab's podcast, Two Bees in a Podcast, and just 3 hours ago, we recorded a segment on combining colonies that'll probably come out in about a month and a half. So stay tuned. But to answer your question, when I started keeping bees when I was 12, I read all the books. My mentor told me when you combine two colonies, you put a piece of newspaper between it and cut a few slits in the newspaper. So the bees, as they chew through that newspaper, they become accustomed to one another so that when they finally are combined, life is good and you have no problems. They also gave a second recommendation, which is if you're combining two colonies, spray everybody with sugar water. And it's hard to hate someone you've just licked all the sugar water off of, right? So the idea is that you do all that and the bees combine just fine. Then I started working with commercial beekeepers and see that they don't do any of that stuff. They combine colonies when they encounter a need to combine colonies. They don't go home and get the newspaper. They don't spray everything with sugar water because it sticks up everything. And when I discovered that, I quit doing those things as well. And fighting is incredibly minimal. And usually when I get the nuke, give that nuke recommendation, everybody instantly will ask, what about fighting? And I hardly ever see it. Hardly ever see it. Maybe never see it. And then the next question is, well, will that parental, strong, but queenless colony, this production colony, really accept the nuke queen that you just put in there to run around freely? And I will say every time I've done it, it's worked, but I understand why people ask that question. So what I always tell people is, if you're really worried about that, cage the nuke queen. And when you move the nuke frames over, move her over in the cage, put it in the hive, and just go back 4 days later and release her. I don't have time for that. Commercial beekeepers don't have time for that. But if you're truly worried, and I completely understand why you would be, just cage the queen.
All right, okay. There's a few questions here which really relates around to treating with Varroa, and really it comes down to what is the best time to treat Varroa. Now that may be slightly different for you in Florida than it would be for the UK or Ireland.
Okie dokie. So what I'm going to do is two things. I'm going to find 2 links to put in the chat box, and I want you to copy and paste those 2 links. The first one, I'll actually walk you through how to do this. So I'm going to put back on my share screen. You guys should see Google. We have a group in the US called the Honeybee Health Coalition, Honeybee Health Coalition. If you Google Honeybee Health Coalition Varroa, and I promise you this is relevant to your question. If you Google Honeybee Health Coalition Varroa, what you just see me do, your very first thing is Varroa management information that the Honeybee Health Coalition developed. What I tell people is it's not a time of year that you're looking for, but a Varroa population that you're looking for. And generally speaking, the recommendation is 3 mites per 100 bees. If that occurs 15 times the year, then we treat 15 times. If it occurs once, then we treat once. So it's not a season that we're targeting Varroa control. It's a time of year. And the Honeybee Health Coalition has a ton of information about Varroa management. It's got a decision support tool to help you know when to treat, that, by the way, would be relevant where you guys are too. It's got videos you can watch on treatments. It's got a guide, a PDF that you can download. It's even got a decision support tool that can walk you through how to know when it's time for you to treat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste this link into the chat box. Boom, and it's there. The second thing that I wanted to do, and it's going to take me just a second longer to do it because I've actually got to open up a document on my own computer, and I'm sorry for that. But just give me just a second and I'll ramble just to keep your attention. My colleague, Dr. Cameron Jack, and I just published, I don't know, you're not supposed to brag about your own stuff, but we just published probably the most thorough scientific document on Varroa control research out there. And it came out last year, and Dr. Cameron Jack reviewed absolutely every document about a research project ever done on Varroa control. And I'm going to bring up that document for you, which I think it's coming up right now. That's an open access document. And I am going to copy and paste the link for that document in the chat box as well. So if you want the extremely practical answer to that, go to the Honeybee Health Coalition's resources. They are amazing. And just to tell you, I'm not a member of the Honeybee Health Coalition. I'm telling you I like them because I really like them. The second thing, if you want the science behind it all, go to this other document where we review every major Varroa control study project ever done on planet Earth. And we talk about how you can know when your Varroa populations are high and the science behind it, treating organically with organic acids, with chemicals, with any method. We even produce, and I know I'm going really fast here, but you now have the links. We even produced at the very end, I need to see how far down the document I am because it's a massive document. It took a lot of work to do this. Let me just show you. Give me just a second. Oh, right here. We even produced a decision tree that you can use to help you walk your way down to what should I do and when. So for example, if you have more than 300 mites per bee, is your colony decreasing in population or increasing in population? If it's this, you go this way. If it's this, you go this way. And it basically walks you through what are my best available options based on the condition that my colony is currently in. So I could answer the question and just say, you know, do these one or two things, or this is better because I'm giving you all the fishing equipment and teaching you how to fish rather than give you the fish. So you have maybe more varroa information than you could possibly ever want to have now. And if go through that, and I think it'll help you out. And I just says no link in the chat box, but I see the two links from my side. So I'm not sure if you guys can see the two links. So
yeah, I think you're all right.
Perfect. So sorry that I didn't exactly answer your question, but I'm telling you, there's more information on those two spots than I can give you in the short time we have.
Right. Okay. Oops. Right. So I'm just trying to get back onto these questions. Again, if the bees' winter stores primarily to keep the cluster warm, do they consume less in a heavily insulated hive, or would the relative warmth of an insulated hive make the bees more active and eat more? It's more related a little bit to the one you touched.
Well, what I would argue is that there's an optimum temperature that they're trying to achieve that neither overeats the food, right? And thermoregulation biology escapes me. I don't remember what that temperature is, but there's an optimum temperature. And yes, if it gets too warm, they'll overeat, and too cold, they won't even get to the food if it's right beside them. So in our podcast, we actually have 2 episodes about insulating colonies with 2 gentlemen who have read every paper that they can find on insulating colonies. I think they're thermodynamic specialists themselves in the real world. So you ought to go look at our podcast, listen to those 2 episodes. One's about insulating colonies in winter. And one gentleman even makes an argument that we should insulate colonies in summer because it helps them thermoregulate in summer better. But just go listen to those 2 podcasts and you'll hear more than you want to know about insulating colonies. But they do talk about all of those questions kind of in those 2 podcast episodes.
Right. Okay. Right. Let's see. I think we'll certainly have to make it. We've gone on. We've answered quite a few questions here. I think we'll make this the last one. And it's a long question here from Chris Farrell. I understand the older foragers become scout bees in a swarm. What I've never understood is why the swarm leaves the nest before the older foragers have located a new home. Surely the older foragers must have noticed some likely homes on their foraging travels, especially as they get ready to swarm. But oh yeah, just as he was commenting then or complimenting Tom Seeley's book. Anyway, that's the question.
Yeah, so just a couple comments about that. Number one, scout bees do start looking for nest sites before they leave the hive. So they have started that process. They're not foraging and scouting. They're foraging or scouting. So the scout bees are not out collecting resources. They're out looking for homes. But the way that I explain it, let me give you a human analogy. Let's say that I am moving to a new city, right? So I have to sell my existing house and buy the new one. But let's say I find the new one before I sell the old one. So I don't have money to buy the new one because it hinges on me being able to sell the old one. So when you're buying and selling a house don't overlap, it can create problems in your life. Well, the same is true for bees. What if they wait until they find the prime real estate to move? Well, in that time, the new queens could have emerged and you start fighting to the death and they may not swarm at all. So there are risks associated with not finding the house first, but there's also risks staying and looking for a house and staying until they find it. And so it appears that bees have chosen the former because it's a less of a risk for them to start scouting, but move out before they find it than it is to start scouting and stay put until they find that perfect spot. So for whatever reason, probably related to queen overlap, they've chosen to leave. So again, biology is messy, so we may find something completely different in the future, but that is what we think right now. And since that was the last question, I'm gonna turn it back over to John, but I want to say thank you guys so much. You've put up with me now for, it looks like about an hour and a half. If you have any questions for me, please let me know. I'll be happy to help any way I can. If you have questions for me, email them to me at that email address you had. Consider looking at our website, consider our podcast, consider following us on social media. And thank you so much. And John, I turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jamie. Thank you. And thank you for an excellent talk. That really was extremely good. And really, ladies and gentlemen, I would really like to thank you all for your attendance. This is the last of our webinars, which we've had in place of a conference. And they seem to have come to an end very quickly, but I do in fact hope that you all enjoyed them. Now, in due course, we will have these webinars, recordings of these webinars available on the Ulster Beekeepers website. Now, I'd hope to have them on by the end of February, but it might be a little bit longer into March. But please be patient and we will certainly have them available. They certainly will be available to registrants, but they will be only on the website for a set period of time, which we're going to set at about 6 months. But again, I'd like to thank certainly everybody who has come, and especially for our overseas guests, really coming from all continents, really. We've had really everybody from every continent, and we are absolutely staggered by the interest in our webinars. So again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for attending, and happy beekeeping for 2022. Good night.